Walvis Bay Corridor Group perhaps has a barometer of Southern African trade or even global trade. How are things looking at this point?
I must say things are looking quite well for us. During the past 10 years since our establishment, we've had to do a lot of things. The first point is really for Namibia. We are also a young country in terms of independence. So we had to go out there and sell Walvis Bay as an alternative trade route for Southern Africa. So I think what we have achieved during the past few years has really brought us to a level where we see some level of maturity.
Perhaps looking more recently, because we had a recession, a global recession a couple of years ago, ending last year. Are you starting to see trade pick up following the end of that recession?
Definitely, the recession actually hit us a little bit late. So we had a downturn, but now things are picking up quite well. But for us, it's really to look at the long term. Strategically, we know there will be some downturns here and there, but to look at the future within the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's really what's our interest.
How are patterns changing at this stage, and how are you positioning yourself to take advantage of these changing patterns?
We look at it from the perspective that Namibia is a country with a small population, only 2 million people. But what we're saying to ourselves is that we have to create an alternative trade route. And these alternative trade routes that we are linking up is really to Angola, Botswana, the Gauteng province of South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and we've even taken cargo as far as Malawi. So we have really provided, to some extent, a real alternative on the west coast of Southern Africa, which we believe can add some value in reducing cost of doing business in the region.
Why would exporters in Gauteng prefer to take the stuff up to Walvis Bay rather than going to Maputo or going to Richards Bay or Durban, which are, I would think, just as close?
Yes, if one look, for instance, at Europe and you look at the Americas and you see where Walvis Bay is located, you can actually ship your goods to the Gauteng market and get it to Gauteng from Europe maybe 5 to 7 days earlier because of the transit time. Because you save about 5 to 7 days in shipping time between Walvis Bay and Durban, because all the ships going to Durban in any case has to pass our waters, whether it's coming to Walvis Bay or not.
So typically who would be using this? What sort of goods are travelling these routes?
Currently we do a lot of project cargo for the region. There's a lot of other potential cargo, but what we would like to focus on in terms of the Gauteng market is really time-critical cargo. Which cargo are critical for some importers and exporters to be utilized in this market, either imports and exports, and that's really our focus. And what we have been doing through this Walvis Bay Corridor initiative is really to focus on two important things, which is also important for everybody in the world, and that is time and money.
And typically, what sort of costs would be saved if you were going from Gauteng to Walvis Bay and up to Europe, as opposed to going to one of the South African ports?
What we're saying is that if you have to look at the total supply chain cost, you can't just look at individual, for instance, road transportation cost or shipping cost. You have to look at the total supply chain. So if you can shave off, say, 5 to 7 days of your exports, it also means for that exporter you will get his money 5 to 7 days earlier. Now taking a container, sometimes a container, one container is the value of about 1 million rand. Now this is in interest. What is that exporter going to save in the process? And that's what I said earlier, that we're looking at the strategic focus in terms of the long term and how the Walvis Bay Corridor initiative can add in terms of the total logistics cost and reducing that in the region.
What sort of growth are you seeing on other routes, such as the Trans-Caprivi route?
I think the Trans-Caprivi, if I always talked about these routes as our kids, and I think it's most probably the fastest growing kit at this stage.
And this goes all the way up to the DRC at the very end?
Yes, we have about 5 years ago we've set up a understanding and an agreement between Namibia, Zambia and DRC, where we're developing this route. And last year on this route we had a growth of 97%. for the year. Although we are in the beginning phases, we have already gained about 5 to 7% of the total copper exports from the copper belt to the markets either in the Far East or going to Europe.
How about infrastructure? Is the infrastructure there? Is the infrastructure good? And do you have to make any investments in infrastructure on these routes? If you look at Namibia, and especially transportation infrastructure, I think it's at a very good level. What we also have, we have about 20 long-term projects that we have set aside already more than 10 years ago that we are developing and we're monitoring all the time in terms of the port expansion, where we will invest about 2 billion rand within the next 2 to 3 years. We're planning railway connections to Zambia, to Botswana. So what we make sure is that we also keep our roads at a good condition, because we know at this stage that road transportation is the biggest percentage in terms of all imports and exports. Of course, it's difficult to manage the roads in other countries such as the DRC, I'm sure.
Yes, but with this forum that we have between ourselves, Zambia and DRC, we discuss these matters, and of course countries differ, but we always try and make sure that we convince them to prioritize these corridors, or especially that one, and make sure that the benefit goes at the end of the day to the importer and exporter, which eventually will turn into a benefit for the consumer, like you and me.